Welcome back to the Space for Faith podcast. My name is Mike Goldsworthy, and it's good to have you back with us. And we have a treat today to have Brit Barron, my friend Brit, joining us today. And we're going to get to talk about your new book, Brit. Do You Still Talk to Grandma? But for folks who don't know you, I know you describe yourself as a storyteller. Do you mind sharing a little bit about like how that works itself out in your life?
Yeah. Hello. I always say all the work I do is storytelling, and I get the opportunity to do that as a pastor at a local church here in LA. I do storytelling workshops for organizations, DEI workshops. I do keynote coaching for folks who have a presentation coming up who are nervous about public speaking. And I am an author and have a book coming out in October.
October 1st, yeah?
Yep, October, kicking off the month.
Look at that. It's like I Googled and I knew what to talk about.
You're on it.
I'm on it. No, and like you're actually, and I'm not just saying this because you're on here, like I've mentioned this to several folks, like you're a phenomenal storyteller. Not only in like, yeah, I've gotten to see little clips of your stand-up. I haven't made my way up there yet, but I keep promising that I will one of these days make my way up to get to see you do stand-up. I'm sitting right now, we're just chatting that I'm sitting right now in South Bend with our friends at South Bend City Church. I'm recording it here, and I preached this Sunday, but you preached the Sunday before, and I listened to your sermon before I came to kind of get a feel for like what I was coming into. And I always want somebody to be mediocre the week before me, that it's like, you know, like I don't want them to just bomb, but like I just want them to be like, people are like, that was fine when they left. And then I come in and they're like, it was amazing. And it was the exact opposite, that you were preaching some of the content from your book, and it was so fantastic. And the way that you tell these stories, I was telling somebody that like you have so much richness of thought, but then the way that you tell it comes across so casual and almost like nonchalant in a way, and I mean it in such like a positive way, that it like comes across as this like casualness, and it's so profound at the same time that it's such a unique skill. I don't know a lot of other folks that have that same sort of skill set in that kind of way. And so anyways, all that to say, like, I think that you're phenomenal at the work that you do of this.
Oh, thank you. No, I can't wait to hear the recording. I'm sure you killed it on Sunday.
Well, I was not looking for that, but I will take it. Now, I got a chance to get to read the book, and I got a bunch of questions, but I'm kind of curious, and I think you talk about this a bit in the book, but I'm kind of curious for folks to get to hear, and maybe it'll give a little bit of an overview of what the book is about. But what was sort of the impetus of the book? What got you stirring to want to write this?
Yeah. Well, it's taken a few forms, but I started initially working on this book in 2021. And so I think we had this big sort of summer revolution in 2020, and we had a lot of social action happening online, and we had a lot of good movement. But the underbelly of that is we also created this weird kind of culture, cancel culture mixed in with some of how we interacted with each other on the internet. It just created a dynamic that really caused me to ask whether or not we were headed in any sort of direction that I wanted to go in. And something I talk about in the book is around that time I had dinner with a group of friends, and one of the friends was saying that her grandma had voted for Trump. And another friend at the table sort of gasped and was like, "Do you still talk to her?" And she was like, "My Nana?" I'm like, yeah, I do, and I was like, oh my gosh, like we're canceling grandmas, like we're there, like what do we do? We seem to have taken our interactions on the internet that are very binary. It's very black and white. There's the internet, you say something I don't like, and then I click unfollow, block, and then it's done. There's not a lot of nuance that exists, but in our real lives, you have grandmas, cousins, partners, friends, college roommates who are all evolving at different spaces and paces than you. And how do we kind of hold some of that? So all of those questions are what led me to write this book.
Yeah, I love that. I just freaking love that story, actually. And the idea of like, yeah, that we've got sort of a framework that we're creating on the way we interact with people online, and that we're now imposing that on people in person. And one of the things that kind of came up for me as I was reading your book is I was thinking about, I have found myself over the last like 5 years in more progressive spaces than I found myself in before that. And there's been several things that have been shocking to me that I think I wasn't expecting. And some of it would maybe fit around like the progressive fundamentalist that used to be a
Hmm.
conservative fundamentalist. You and I and others have talked a lot about that. But you, the way that you frame this was really helpful for me. You talk about progressive amnesia. And I'm going to read something that you wrote and then let you chat a little bit about it. You said, progressive amnesia is the tendency to forget conveniently our own lapses and learning trajectories. It's what happens when we disconnect from our personal growth histories and allow ourselves to forget our own pasts. Yeah, do you mind just like riffing a little bit on progressive amnesia and what we're experiencing around that?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, progressive amnesia it's easy to fall into, right? Because sometimes when we experience growth, or like I experience growth and I evolve and I learn something new and I adopt that as a way of life, it feels natural to me. I feel like, oh, maybe this is how I've always been, right? Oh, I've always been affirming. Oh, I've always been, inclusive. Oh, I've always cared about justice. So I've always, all these things. But the reality is that's just not true. There was always a time before we knew what we know now. None
Yeah,
of us
yeah.
were born knowing all the things we exist in now. And the danger and feeling like we've always been where we are now is then it gives us a little moral high ground to look at people who maybe aren't where we are. So it's me looking at evangelicals, conservative, fundamentalist evangelicals, and being like, you're stupid. Or are you me 15 years ago? Right. And so there's a different kind of moral high ground that you really can't occupy when you are in tune with the reality that, oh, you used to sit in those seats, or you used to think that, or you didn't know that at some point, right?
Yeah. Yeah, like you tell a story about and I think maybe you told this in the sermon out here also about leading like a purity culture camp, and that like looking
Yeah.
back and that you're like, there are people in therapy today going, Brit taught me these things, having to undo
Yes.
right? Like that was a real wake up call for me to own some things that like I think I haven't wanted to necessarily own, that I was a part of perpetuating, that like today I would be ashamed of. But it's not just about being ashamed of it, but it's also like I need to own that I've done some damage, and also like, oh, there are other people who are doing that same sort of thing that are me 15, 20 years ago.
Yeah. And that's something I believe to my core is I'm like, it doesn't change any of the work. I still think that we need to dismantle these systems. I still think that purity culture is wildly harmful.
Yeah.
I think that non-inclusive ideologies, I think that homophobic theology, all of these things need to um, be taken out, need to be fought against. However, my approach to that work changes when I am close to the reality that I once not only believed, but also perpetrated some of these messages. That I know how that feels. So in dismantling it and wanting to take it down, it looks a lot less like me standing up on a high mountain and being like, you people down there, you peasants, you're wrong. And it looks a lot more like me being like, okay, now that I know and I can stay close to what it feels like to sit in those seats, I think I know the messages of transformation that might be more appropriate, that might actually make some movement.
Yeah. So I'd be curious, like, what this is a little bit of a sidetrack from the book, but I'm curious, like, what to
Mhm.
do with that. Because I was thinking about some of the stuff that I did in the church. I was thinking also about like, I was remembering a time I was I went to Pasadena City College for my first 2 years of college, and I was in a English class, and we read Dr. King's "While We Still Can't Wait." And I remember
Mhm.
our class got in a conversation. I grew up in La Cañada. So like, like folks listening might not
Yep.
know that, but that gives you a little context. And
Hmm.
so like upper middle class, pretty white, pretty Asian. And so I'm in this like highly diverse college classroom, and we're talking about Dr. King's book. And there's a young black woman who starts talking about the need for reparations. And it like, I don't know all of what was going on in me, but it hit me in this way because I don't think I'd ever experienced it that directly confronting me as a white man. And I remember standing up and arguing with her. And I was like, my ancestors didn't own slaves. They lived in this part of the country. And we went back and forth on this. And like, I have so much like, maybe not shame, but like embarrassment around it. And I'm like, gosh, I'm holding a bunch of these sort of things. So some of the things that I taught and perpetuated in the church, some of the things that like as just a upper middle class white guy who hadn't had larger exposure and had a certain vantage point and who like listened to Rush Limbaugh on occasion and
Hmm.
like what do I do with all of that now that like I'm in a different place and I look back at like 15, 20, 30 years ago Mike and like yeah.
You deal with it. And here's what I mean by that is like, so I shared this with that James Baldwin says, I imagine the reason people cling so tightly to hate is because they fear once the hate is gone, they'll be forced to deal with pain. Right.
Yeah. That's good.
Um,
That's really good.
and so I think for a lot of people, like in your position, I think about this all the time. If you would, so let's say you just stayed there, right? And you just like, and you never evolved. Well, now you're 40, 50 years in to thinking that. At some point, you're like, I don't even know if I still think this, but I can't deal with the fact that I've built a whole life on this thing,
Yeah, that's right.
right? So I'm going to double, triple, quadruple down. I think for someone like you and for someone like me, you have this vision of you standing up and arguing with this Black woman, a thing that today makes you want to cringe. You know, she's probably somewhere processing, like, I was in community college just trying to like get my degree, and this white man wanted to stand up and argue with me, and that, you know, that's part of her trauma now. And then I've got these times where I stood up on these stages and I talked to these young girls about their body and puberty culture, all these things, and their process. All of those things, we have to hold those. I think we have to know what those feels like for when we encounter how you encounter now Black women, how you encounter people who still may be where you were when you felt and stood up. You now have to like be able to hold that, to feel the pain of that, and then to have it inform your work accordingly. There's no like, okay, say this thing and do this, and then that never happened or that goes away, or right. It's, you know, I think for who you are and where you are in the world now, it would be easier to be like, yeah, I'm just a progressive guy and I always have been. And I'm from Southern California and I've always understood these things. And I've always been on the quote unquote right side of the line, you know. But I think the realer thing is like, gosh, growing up as a white man in the context I did made me think it was okay to like stand up in this class and argue with this woman about reparations. I think that's an important thing for you to stay close to.
Yeah. Gosh, it's so freaking hard, right? Like I was thinking as you were sharing that, it's a lot easier to just sort of move on. And I wonder if that's a part of like what we experience in folks where we end up in places where we're looking down on people in places where maybe we used to be because we don't want to, like you were reading of the, or you were quoting James Baldwin there of the, like, we don't want to engage the hurt. And so as a result of that, like, it's just easier to sweep it under the rug.
Yeah. And listen, when I look at some of the conversations online on the internet, yeah, you may feel like you're making a good point, but what it looks like is people screaming, I'm hurting, so I want you to hurt too. I
That's
feel
good.
shame, so I want you to feel shame too. And
Yeah.
I'm like, you know, I don't know many people. Like for you to go on the trajectory and tell me, like, if you were to line up, okay, from that moment of standing up and arguing with that woman until right now, like tell me the one thing you read on Twitter that
Yep.
made you go from there to here.
Yeah, no, that's right. That's right. Um, okay, well, so I feel like this is around the same sort of thing. One of like the things that I found myself underlining multiple times that I grabbed, like maybe for me, what was maybe the quote from your book that kind of like I've come back to now. I finished your book a couple weeks ago. I've come back to it multiple times since then. It is kind of in this sort of a vein. You wrote, I do not have all the answers to know the difference between fighting for a just cause and being swept up in extremism, but I have learned to make room for healthy suspicion about my own righteousness. About the idea of like, I think if I remember right, this was in the midst of you build some like a case for like differentiating between cancel culture and the idea of like moving towards transformation. And we could talk maybe a little bit about that too, but this idea of like having healthy suspicion about my own righteousness, like that's been a really helpful framework for me.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, you know, this is all a part of it, right? Is I think our temptation is to be like, okay, I was wrong over there. Okay, I was wrong when I was doing these things. I was wrong over there, but now I made it. Now I have the right ideology, I
Yep.
have the right theology, I have the right friends, I have the right community, I have the right views about God, I read the right books, I listen to the right podcasts. Finally, I am fully on the right side of the line. And I feel like that anytime I start to feel that, I need to question it. I need to be open to change. Not that I'm wrong, not that I'm right, but anytime I feel absolute certitude about my rightness, right? If I'm feeling like I need to be open to the idea that there still might be more change for me and I have not sort of fully arrived. And I think that is the only true position, right? Because th- there's I distinguish this. I think in a lot of social justice movements, at least in our current moment today, something that's frustrates me is that I think a lot of activists and progressive folks are more concerned with the how than they are concerned with the what. And I think if we are just concerned with the what, then we acknowledge that the how can always be a moving target. If the what is liberation, the what is transformation, the what is freedom, okay, well then I don't want to get into an argument about the how. That's a moving target, right? That shifts and moves and I need to let it. I'm never gonna have that fully figured out.
Yeah. Yeah. Does it feel to you? One of the things that I have wondered is if, like, it felt like the politics of, say, 20 years ago felt like, gosh, we've got folks on the right and on the left who share some, like, not everything of common values, but share some common values. And a lot of the conversation is around a difference of how to approach those values, of how, like, how do you approach it through empowering government or empowering small businesses? Do you approach
Hmm.
that, right? Is it more about individual rights or communal rights? Is like, felt like it was a lot more like that. And it feels like um, those common shared things feel like they have drifted further and further apart. Does that feel right? Or um, yeah, what?
It 100% it feels like that. I don't know how much of that is, and I don't just want to say these things are perception, but I do
Okay.
think the stories that we are told around certain things. So I think it can seem like if you are a progressive or you are a liberal, that every single person who is a conservative or Republican is the most extreme version of that thing. And I think that's true for the other side as well.
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
I think every, Republican thinks that like liberals wake up and then they roll a die that has pronouns on it and then they pick one and then they go and they get um yeah, I don't know what they think is happening around, but it's something like that. And then I think we all think I'm like every Republican has a torch and a sheet over their head burning across. Like and a lot of that is sort of narrative when I think the reality is what we know in our lives, or who I know in my lives, are these I know conservatives, I know Republicans who I think there are things in the world that we both say this needs to be different. And then we really don't align on how that happens.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably true for you as well, is that what you just described, how it used to like quote unquote feel 20 years ago, is probably still how it feels in a lot of your personal relationships. But we have this overarching media narrative that says
Yeah.
like the sides have never been farther, the poles have never been more opposite, the ends have never been more extreme. And maybe that's true, but that's actually far less people than are sort of in the middle.
Yeah. So it's like the work is figuring out that thing that's actually the thing that's behind it, that like is that common shared vision, value that like we have different ideas maybe about the way that it might work itself out, but we can still get to that same thing on board. I'm even thinking within churches, like one of the things that I've noticed happen in churches really, really since 2015, 16, it started like seeming like it became harder and harder, is that we used to have a lot more churches that tried to have, for lack of a better term, like a large middle ground, that we had people that were in a lot of different places. I remember I preached a sermon before the 2012 elections at my church, and before it went out into the parking lot and counted cars, bumper stickers on cars, and we were almost 50-50 on bumper stickers on who was voting for who. And I thought, oh gosh, this is so beautiful. We have this kind of church where all kinds of different people can coexist, and it feels like, gosh, that's become worse and worse. And it's become harder and harder in the church. Like, are you seeing anything in the church? Do you have any words for church leaders that are trying to figure out how to create space for different kinds of people? Can that exist in the church? Should it exist in the church?
Yeah. Well, I think, wait, I mean, let's just call it what it is. We have probably the singularly most polarizingly upsetting candidate we've ever had.
Yeah, that's right.
So, I mean, I think people didn't love Mitt Romney, but they were like, man, you know what I mean?
Sure.
People didn't love Obama, but they're kind of like, man, you know what I mean? Now it's more extreme because the narrative, the rhetoric, the candidate is just more extreme, you know? And so I think the difficulty there is, how can we have a conversation? At least this is what I have found. I don't know that there are many people in our church who, on a presidential level, are voting differently. Probably in a community like ours, it's more so like, are you voting Democrat? Are you voting Independent? You're not voting.
Yeah.
And I could be wrong, but it's probably not going to be 50-50. And by probably not, I mean, it's not. And to that end, I think we do see a lot more polarization from that. I think most church communities are going to fall one way or the other, majority.
But because of a particular candidate, not because of political ideology.
A combo, but
Okay.
yeah, I think this candidate, I think where we can have conversations. So the beauty is, again, is sort of like unclustering, I think, some of those, like, so even within our community, we're not going to have a lot of diversity on the table, or so it would seem, about presidential candidates. But we are going to have a lot of diversity on. So we live in LA. What is happening in homelessness in our city is wild.
Yes.
And what we do have is a community who, I think every single person in our community would say, people deserve to be housed. People deserve dignity. People deserve these common, the Maslow's hierarchy of needs and things that we need to survive. I think every single person in our church community would have this primary, like, how? We're all over the map. I think there's, you know what I mean? Like,
Yep.
we're not going, we don't agree. We don't think certain services should be carried out by certain people. We agree on what is the role. We agree on if we even should have police, if we should defund the police, if we should abolish police, if police should be trained to assess mental health issues, if we should do social workers, if social workers are even doing this, if it's housing first, if it's healing first, if it's wraparound services, if it's mental health, if it's addiction, nothing. Right. And that's where I'm like, this is what I mean by primary and secondary beliefs that I talk about in the book, is for there to be community, I think there has to be a shared reality and primary beliefs. And that primary belief can be broad. It could be every single human being is deserving of dignity. Okay. Well, now when we get into what dignity means, well, now I have to be open and willing to taking in new information and changing and understanding that the house is different, right? I think there are just a lot of differences that we can understand in what brings human dignity.
That's a really helpful and good illustration. That's really helpful. Okay, we've kind of gotten off on a tangent, but it was kind of interesting to me. I appreciate that. I apologize for that, though. Also, Friends, her book is not about getting into the weeds around this kind of stuff, but it is about Like,
And yeah.
how do we coexist together in the midst of like differences, and when you have grown apart from folks that you used to align with, and how do we overcome some of those barriers? And in the midst of that, you tell a story about visiting Father Richard Rohr that like was really helpful for me, and you talked about a couple of things. I'll let you tell it, and then like I can tell you the things that kind of stood out to me if as you share it. But do you mind sharing a little bit about your experience with Richie Rohr?
Yeah. Good old Father War. Um, so I got, an experience to go and share some time with him, and he's like a big hero. I would say once I started deconstructing my own faith, he just became this like every progressive thought I had that I was like, this is revolutionary. He actually wrote a book about it 30 years ago, So I
Yeah,
was like,
yeah.
okay, wow. Yeah, okay, he's doing what I want to be doing, and he's been doing it a lot longer. And so we got to spend this weekend with him, and I remember thinking like I had all these thoughts about the church that I had just left, and the structure and just conservative evangelicalism as a whole, and all these negative ideas. And so I remember we were sitting in the room and someone asked him a question, and but it was really a question that was like not a question, it was like kind of self-congratulatory, like, "Hey, Richard Rohr, why do you think that we're better than those other
Yes.
dummies in those other kind of spaces?" Right? And that wasn't the question, but it was. You know what I mean? Um, and he literally just said, "Here are all the things I think," and he gave this really spot on critique of evangelicalism, you know, in it. It's in all the ways. And I was like, yes, 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 yes. And then he was like, and now I want to take a second to talk about some of the things I've learned from evangelicals. And I was like, no, you can't do that. We, that's the other team. You can't, there's nothing redemptive over there. And so he started talking about all these things that he has learned from evangelicals and he's grateful for them teaching. And it was just a reminder of, oh, there is room for both. There's like there's just we can hold it. Your grandma can be really nice and have taught you a lot of things, and she's homophobic. And what does that cancel out? I don't think and that's not even the equation. I think it's just those things just exist together.
Yes. I loved that. That was like I felt like such a helpful part. Like you talk about that in a few different kinds of ways, but that like yeah, these two things can both be true and sit by each other. And the other thing that like stood out to me when you're sharing the Richard Rohr story was that like you mentioned something about like we're constantly looking for an outside expert to validate like where we're at. That it was like, oh
Yeah.
yeah, having Father Richard like validate these thoughts that I had was helpful, right?
Yeah. Yeah, we love an external authority. And I think it's kind of universal, but it's also it's also a little specifically American in that we just want it. And I joke that I have so many friends who have left the church and they're just like, it's so crazy that a person with a microphone has all the answers for me and all these pastors I'm never listening to again. But then like they will walk off the cliff if Brene Brown asks them nicely. Um, because she just became their new external authority. And we just kind of we go from like external authority to external authority looking for someone who's gonna hand us all the answers. When the reality is all so much of our own work is to yes, listen to these brilliant teachers and writers and thinkers, but then funnel it through what does this mean for me? What do I need to keep? What do I need to leave? And how can I foster my own internal compass?
Yeah. Like, when do you feel like you started being able to trust yourself? Was there some sort of shift that happened? Was it like a gradual thing? Did you wake up one day and you're like, holy crap, like, this is where I'm at now?
I think the work started when I had to make a decision to sort of choose things that I was feeling that I knew would put me on the outside of what my community felt,
Okay.
right? And just in terms of being queer and existing in a church space that wasn't affirming. I feel like so much of that work in therapy was my therapist saying, "You you know what you want, you know what you need." That was that whole journey for me of being like, "Hey, I know that this is good. I don't feel like I'm bad. I don't feel like I'm going to hell. I don't feel like this like really awesome thing that I'm experiencing and feeling and falling in love is going to send me to hell." And that sort of opened the door for me being like, "Hey, why should I listen to them when I could listen? You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
why is their voice louder than mine? And it's not matching up. I think there's something there.
Yeah. And even like to Christianize it a little bit, it's like the same spirit of God that's in them is the same spirit of God that's in you.
Yeah, exactly. And I think
Um,
I'm always saying that at our church now. I'm like, we just are the ones who get to spend time crafting conversations every week, and I love that. But I have no more access to God than you. You have no more access to God than me. It's the same divinity that resides in all of us.
yeah, that's good. Well, and that makes me towards the end of the book, you start talking about the way that you and your wife Sammy like try to live fully present in your life. You talk about like not wanting to miss anything, not falling asleep, not being on autopilot, not missing like the goodness that's in front of you. Yeah, do you mind like sharing a little bit about that and even like how that fits into this idea of like connecting with the difficulties of relationships in the world that we find ourselves in?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I talk about it, we both have tattoos that say stay awake. And that is like my biggest fear is that I wake up one morning and I'm like, where did the last 10 years go? Or 5 years or 2 days or whatever it is. Because I know my own tendency and ability to sort of just zone out. Um, I think I could do that in a lot of ways. I am really good at numbing with social media. Like I could be on TikTok and I days, it's like I don't have to eat, I don't have to sleep. All of a sudden I don't even have any like human somatic needs. You know what I mean? I'm just like
Yep.
watching dog training videos, like things that don't even apply to me. You know what I mean? They're like how to, disassemble a Cybertruck. I'm like, oh, I might need this. And so our goal is always to stay full, like as present as possible. And something that keeps me so constantly grounded and present is the real life that's happening around me, my real relationships, the real truths, the things I'm feeling, the conversations I'm having, and the things that I'm experiencing. What brings me out of that moment very quickly is being like, what? Some lady in South Dakota said this? I can't even believe that. And then I like marinate on it and then I stew on it. And then I think like, yeah. And I bet everyone in her and her whole community and everyone thinks this, everyone's out to get me. I can't believe that everyone's out to get me. And then I started spiraling. But the more I ground in my real life, those conversations are just as hard um, a lot of the time, but they're real, and they're happening and they're three-dimensional.
Yeah.
Um, and I get to sit with those and marinate in those. And that's just the different kind of feeling to be present in this reality right now in this three-dimensional space.
Yeah, that's really good. And I appreciate that. I appreciate the way that you all approach your life. I appreciate the way that like, yeah, you engage in those kinds of ways. I texted you this and I genuinely mean it. Like I think that this is a beautiful book. I think it's so good. I think it's actually just shared with the church out here in South Bend when I was referencing your sermon that I told them, I said, I think that this is the book that you need to read for this moment in time. I think it's really important.
Mhm.
And so, friends, I'm going to put a link to the show notes. But two things before we jump off here. First, I want to make sure, is there anything that you feel like would be helpful to talk about that I didn't ask you about that we're missing in this conversation?
No, thank you. Asked great questions. We even got to go on some tangents. I love it.
It's fun times. Well, I thought it might be fun. I didn't set you up for this, so see if you're able to do it on the fly.
Okay.
I thought it might be fun with like the way that I've gotten to be up at the church that you pastor at, New Abbey, and the way that you end your service. You also ended the service here at South Bend with it, and I just thought, like, gosh, what you do and the way that you offer a sort of benediction to the service, I think is so helpful and so moving. And I thought it might be a nice way for folks to kind of like end our time together.
Yeah. Would you stand and grab the hand of the person next to you? Something that we say all the time in our community, and I love that you asked us. We always say we're striving for unity, not uniformity. And we do that by holding the hand of the person next to us and just remembering the reality that the person whose hand we're holding is different from us. Different in that they could be carrying grief or joy, pain or loss, joy or freedom. They may be Republican, Democrat, Independent. They may be rich. They may be poor. They may be a different ethnicity, race, sexuality, gender identity, all of these things. And the only way that we are ever able to hold the nuance for the person next to us is if we're able to hold it for ourselves. And if we can hold it for ourselves, if we can hold it for our neighbor, then we can begin to do the most audacious things that Jesus ever asks, and that's to hold it for our enemy. And I think that's the goal and where we're headed. So that's my hope for all of us.
I get goosebumps genuinely every time I hear you say that. That's really moving. Thanks, Brit. Thanks for being here, friends. Check out Do You Still Talk to Grandma? I'll have links to it in the show notes.